Welcome to the St. Matt's podcast. Once again, I'm Josh House here with Rob Marola, and we're ready to take your questions, comments about last week's sermon, or about things that are on your mind generally, faith, life, and so forth. Rob, welcome back.
Thanks, Josh.
You were on vacation this weekend in Pennsylvania.
I was. My wife was celebrating her 70th birthday, which is an amazing thing, hard to believe. And so gathered our kids and their families, and my brother and his wife came up, and we had a very nice celebration of her birthday.
Great.
It's an area of Pennsylvania that I've been going for 60 years. So it's and Linda and I and our family have probably been going there for 40 years. So and now, of course, we have our grandson Finley, who he's 3 years old, and getting to share that with him is a lot of fun also.
Sounds like you were kept pretty busy with the whole family.
We kept pretty busy. Yep, every day we had a variety of things going, and it was hot up there, but certainly not hot like down here. And you actually want it hot because the water is so cold that you want to, if the air isn't hot enough, you go in that cold water, you just freeze. But if the air is nice and hot, then you go in the cold water, and it's just exceptionally refreshing. That's what we did. We laid in a lot of cold water.
I was going to ask, so yeah, you got some swimming in.
We did, yeah, in
Cool.
both little mountain lakes and little pockets in mountain streams, and somewhere in the Forbes Forest, if anybody knows, called the Blue Hole, where a spring comes right out of the bottom, and it's about 52 degrees, and that is really cold.
Do you have any spiritual insights that you were able to pick up along the way?
Oh, well, that is an awesome question. And as I think I told you, I've been reading Galatians over and over again in relation to the fruit of the Spirit. But what I read for this week was I read 1 Corinthians 13, which we did 2 summers ago, which is the chapter that just talks about love. And I prayed that every day that God would help me to live that in relation to my family.
Hmm.
So I did better some days than others.
You always hear that read at weddings, and it's all aspirational and nice. But I guess post the wedding, when the family is together and on vacation together, that might be where it's really tested.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Love is patient, love is kind, not easily angered. We had four. Well, we had more than four because my daughter's husband's families are blended in there. So you have several family systems all being blended in together, and they all have strengths and they all have weaknesses, and they all share some similarities and they all share some differences. So bringing all those into proximity with each other is beautiful and challenging. And so that's where I think living in love really gains flesh and blood embodiment. We had great time doing fun things. And we had great time where family systems bumped up against each other a couple times, or where our family system, the Rolla family system, broke down in sort of predictable ways where it often breaks down. Sitting down and having hard but good conversations about how we love each other better. So, a wide range of experiences, and like I said, some a little more challenging, others, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it sounds like probably good advice to people as they embark on summer vacations to pick up First Corinthians and make their way through it. See an early Christian community learning how to get along and love each other.
Yeah, you could sure do a lot worse than starting every day and saying, "This is going to be my program for the day," and at the end of the day, saying, "Okay, how'd I do? Where can I, thank you, Lord, for your help here, and I'll lean into this a little bit more tomorrow. And boy, tomorrow I could use a little work on this."
Yeah.
And we've probably gone on enough about this, but one of the things that just surprises me after being alive for a lot of years is how I have some dominant lifelong scripts, which I learned, from my mom and dad, and they learned from their mom and dad, and some of those are really good, and some of them are not helpful at all. And I've worked really, really hard to amend some of those less helpful scripts. But if the right configuration of events or interactions occur, it'll send me right back into those old scripts, and I can do a downward spiral with the best of them. And so it just kind of I can start the day aspirational, and I can have these high ideals, and I can feel like I'm doing okay, and then all of a sudden a few things come together, and boy, I'm at my worst instead of at my best, and
Mm.
so that creates opportunities all around for people to learn how to love each other better. So that's just to say, perhaps as a start, that I don't know that there is any perfect family vacation, and if we go in expecting a perfect family vacation, it's probably going to be disappointing, right?
Yeah.
But if we started saying, okay, this is going to be really good, there's likely to be some pain points, and I'm likely to be the cause of, at least some of those. But then to be able to move through them relatively quickly, to move from what they call rupture to repair, I think that can make for, in some ways, an even better time than if we just glide across the surface.
Yeah. Yeah. And those family systems are present also in a church family. I'm
Yes,
I
they
think
are.
that church was able to go off in your absence this weekend without completely breaking down.
It sounds like you all did fantastic. Sounds like you personally did fantastic. Sounds like everybody had a great time together. I could not be more pleased. I hear and have heard. I haven't listened to all of it. I was listening to a portion of it on Sunday morning, and then everybody got up and things got going, so I didn't finish it. But what I heard, I certainly loved, and what I've heard from people, they've all said how much they enjoyed Sunday sermon. You preached on Paul and the law and the American Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's ambitious.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said in some of the later services, someone mentioned at 8 o'clock that I was ambitious just for even touching Romans,
Yeah.
which is always fun, and would be a great subject for more questions if you want to submit any questions at stmats.org/question. Romans is chock full of confusing things, including the word salad that we got from Paul in chapter 7 this week about wanting to do what he doesn't want to do and doing what he doesn't like to do and doing other things too and all of that. So, but it's a favorite. Well, we've got some questions following the sermon and this past week, 4th of July, of course, and I think the questions have a little bit to do with that and
Sure.
our civic life together. So the first one is, apparently there are 35 plus Bible verses that refer to taking care of widows and orphans. It excludes many groups. Why?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, and a thoughtful question, and I love that somebody's reading the Bible and taking the Bible seriously.
I haven't double checked the 35 number, but if anything, that seems like it might be an undercount.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, widows and orphans are mentioned a lot. I think, and I'm interested in your perspective on this too. I think that what they're saying, it's not pay attention to these and exclude other people, but the ability of any given system, culture, government, whatever it is, to pay attention to its weakest members really determines in many ways the quality of a system. So if all you're taking care of is the rich and powerful, because they can return the favor in some way, shape, or form, they can give you money, they can do you a favor, they can make you look good, all those sorts of things. Well, that's a pretty self-serving system. But if you're looking at the weakest members of your culture, your family, your country, whatever system you're a part of, and these folks, because they are your weakest members, you're truly your most vulnerable members. I think vulnerable becomes a buzzword, and I don't think we always even necessarily think about what that means. But in that day and age, vulnerable meant was they were right on the line between life and death. If unfavorable winds blew upon them, they didn't just miss their mortgage for a month or miss their energy payment for a month, or they didn't just go, they didn't have to eat dog food for a meal instead of what they died, right? I mean,
Right.
so when we're talking about vulnerability, we're talking about real vulnerability.
Like this wasn't a society where if you were a widow, you could just go get a job and start supporting yourself. Uh, even assuming you could have the talent and ability. I mean, that's not the world they lived in. Someone whose main breadwinner has just deceased, people they've left behind, whether it's children, the spouse, completely without help in that day and age. There wasn't like a complex, even sort of social transfer system to back up the income lost. And so it's almost like those categories today, like a modern person who has lost a spouse or a modern person who has lost their parents, while still tragic, obviously, it's not an economic death sentence as it perhaps once was.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so this is one of those things you would come and say, do we take the Bible literally, or do we really look at the principles behind what's saying, say, how do we apply those? Well, I think there still is a literal aspect to widows and orphans. A widow may not be the most vulnerable person in our society. I mean, there can be some very powerful widows because we do have all those systems that we have designed, rightly so, to take care of people when a partner has deceased. And so to actually apply these verses, we'd really want to look at who are the people who are the least able to take care of themselves and say, what's our obligation to caring for them? How am I called to be my brother's or sister's keeper in relation to the people who are least able to take care of themselves? In this day and age, those verses might be about the people who are struggling with mental illness or something like that, because we know we have a huge increase in mental illness in our society and tremendously insufficient resources to help those folks. And so many of the problems that we see are just symptomatics of deeper problems that nobody's really addressing, and that in many ways the church is probably uniquely capable of
Mm,
addressing.
yeah.
So that's sort of how I take that. I think, for instance, and I won't go into the details of this one, but there was one time I was probably 13 years old. My mom did something that made me mad, and I, backtalked or something like that. And my dad got home from work, and my mom went straight to my dad and said, your son, da, 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 da. It was her son too, but she probably didn't use those words. She probably said our son. But anyhow, my dad took me aside, and he, in no uncertain terms, and I mean, really, he sort of took, the physical distance between us down to sort of zero, and just really sort of face to face, man to man, not in a way that I felt threatened, but I knew that he meant business. He said, Rob, I'm going to live with your mother my whole life long. I'm not going to live with you your whole life long. So you need to straighten up and fly right, or you're no longer welcome in this household,
Mm,
right? And that was actually a tremendous gift, because what my dad didn't throw my mom under the bus. He didn't say conspiratorially, we both know your mom can sometimes be a handful.
mm,
You know, we both know your mom gets a little emo or whatever. He could have said any one of 100 things and conspiratorially said, the two of us, we just kind of need to make allowance for. No, he said, I'm 100% in her corner, and you need to get in her corner too. And what that said to me was, when push came to shove, he was going to be 100% in my corner too.
yeah.
And so rather than that being something that caused insecurity, that was a gift of great security, because I knew he went to bat for my mom. I knew that he was 100% in the corner. I knew he'd always go to bat for me, always be 100% in my corner. The way he cared for her was the way I knew he'd care for me. And that brought a sense of security and well-being into our whole family system. And so I think that's what's being said here is that, by that point, when I'm 13 years old, I'm physically bigger than my mother. I'm stronger than my mother. My mother's become weak. She's become vulnerable. And my dad is saying, no, right? We're going to protect your mom. We're going to love your mom. We're going to be good to your mom. I think what this is doing is picking up people and saying, we don't have to be good to these folks. In one sense, the whole system, I mean, it's awful to even say, often to even think, but you might say the whole system is better off without them. They're just a drag, right?
Right.
An economic drag, whatever. And Christianity doesn't say that. It says, no, as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me.
Yeah.
So the test of the whole system isn't how well we assimilate the rich and the powerful, but it's how we treat the least of these people who really can't do anything for us.
Yeah, and I think that's part of taking it literally. I don't actually think that is taking it sort of metaphorically or looking for principles behind it. I think so much of biblical literature wants us to think about what does the story figure, or what is the narrative itself being symbolic of? Like the genre of scripture itself, wants us to take that deeper look. And so, like, one of the examples I always give is when Jesus is healing people, he seems to heal certain types of people. Like, there's an old atheist shibboleth about, like, God never heals amputees, you
Yeah,
know?
right.
But of course, there's all these blind people being healed. But the thing is, when you look at, for instance, John's gospel, the transition from I was blind and now can see has these deeper spiritual resonances. Jesus was not the only holy man going around healing people.
Right.
There were a bunch of them.
Right.
What was unique was, and the reason it was recorded, was what was Jesus healing? And what did those healings tell people about who he was? Was he the Messiah? Was he the one God sent to save the world? Was he God's self? It's the actual healings. And I think there's something about widows and orphans that strikes the same note. Yeah, of course there are other vulnerable people in society. Even in the Bible, there are other groups mentioned, people who are exiles, people who are aliens, people who are victims of war. But especially if the way God is going to reveal God's self is as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it makes sense that widows and orphans, families who have lost that father figure, would feature prominently in these healing, in these restoration stories, and in these injunctions about who the church ought to look after. Well, it's because the church, in looking after widows and orphans, is perhaps being a father figure, and in that sense, being God in the world, being the ultimate father figure, um, in the way that the church lives out its calling.
Yeah.
So there is perhaps even a symbolic reason, which I think, again, you shouldn't put against taking it literally. I think it can be both of those things. There's a symbolic reason for why widows and orphans play such a huge role in the church's ministry.
Yeah, I like that. It's a great question.
Thank you for submitting it.
Yeah, thank you for submitting it.
We have another question?
We do have another question. This is, in some ways, a tough question. You've had a little more time to think about it than I am, so I'm going to throw this one your way. Our country appears to be moving toward fascism and away from a democratic form of government. How will the face of Christianity appear/look under fascism?
There's a lot in there. I think the first thing I want to address is there's clearly a concern underlying this question, a deep concern, a deep love for the country, a deep concern about the direction of the country, perhaps a bit of fear and anxiety. And so I want to first, I think, acknowledge those because I think a lot of our listeners might maybe even disagree with the factual premises of the question, and we can get to that.
Sure.
But what we shouldn't overlook is the questioner's very, I think, sincere concerns about the direction of society. So
Yes.
I think it's probably first important to acknowledge that.
I think that's great you acknowledge that. That's the first thing that jumped out at me too. And maybe even a second thing before we jump into it is that at St. Matthew's, we've always placed a certain amount of limit on our public discourse because you never know who's listening. And we don't want to alienate listeners right up front. While we're willing to,
We'll alienate them later when they're tired of us.
yeah, right. We'll go to the mat in a personal conversation.
Sure.
Right. So anything you and I want to talk about or anybody would talk about, we'll be completely open and honest, and we'll push the boundaries as far as we want to push the boundaries in that. But that's because we're in a conversation. That's because I don't just get to unload on you and just you passively have to accept everything. It's you can push back, right? And so we have little conversation. So part of the problem with this is in a podcast is all the people who are listening, they get subjected to our view, but they don't have any chance to respond to it and modify it or correct it or anything else. So we want to be careful what we say publicly.
And that even goes for the questioner, because I think that in a conversation, my first response would be, well, what do you mean by fascism?
Sure.
Right? Even because what I assume they don't mean is that, the United States is adopting the policies of Benito Mussolini in the 1920s and 30s in Italy. I assume they mean perhaps a modern form, something that resonates with those policies, perhaps some authoritarian bent, but it's pretty amorphous at that level. And so I don't understand in a podcast, I don't have the ability to understand the particular concerns and definitions and usages of words that I would if I were in the room with the person who asked it.
Exactly, and it's only in understanding those particulars that you're really able to address the concern, right?
Right.
And I think that's really sort of the first question is, what are we really talking about here? Because it's only in knowing what we really talk about that we can really address what is the deeper concern.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although maybe my next answer to this question suggests that it doesn't matter what those
Okay.
terms are. And here's why, because we see both in the New Testament, but also throughout the early church, Christianity existing under a wide variety of different forms of government, of different policies. I mean, the Roman Empire in the first 300 years of Christianity will swing wildly between outright persecution, like murderous persecution, to tolerance, to full on endorsement at a certain point. I suppose at that point you're getting into the 5th century, but it takes, it goes all these different forms. And even in the gospels you see centurions, Roman centurions who many Jewish believers at the time would have looked at as the bad guys come to faith. And you also see many people who would otherwise be the good guys. I mean, people even forget the Pharisees in the particular strands of Judaism from which Christianity springs. The Pharisees are the good guys, right? There are
Right.
other Jewish groups that are considered either too violent or they're considered too extremist or they're considered too in league with the Romans. And the Pharisees are often maligned because of the way we interpret many of the stories today. But they were earnest and strong. I mean, I often think that if Jesus came today, he would be speaking to us, to those in the church, as he did the Pharisees. So all that is to say that where my mind went when looking at this question is Christianity might not look that different at all because it has always existed under a wide variety of public institutions. I think that's what makes it a kingdom of another world, right? I mean, that's we see even that in the Gospels. We see it throughout Christian history. Is it is not like earthly kingdom. So that'd probably be my next answer. And I think the questioner is probably most concerned about Christianity, American Christianity, right? The modern forms of it, not Christianity maybe writ large, but
Right.
the things we've come to know as Christianity, Christian institutions, maybe even things like mainline denominations like the Episcopal Church, in a world where certain policies are shifting and shifting, in a way that here they call fascist, but we could just say shifting in general. Um, I think that's probably the questioner's concern. My brain instantly goes, well, it'll look different, but I don't know what it'll look like, right? And that'll always be the case. We're already, we're seeing certain faith-based organizations having lost funding.
Yep.
Like many secular organizations have lost funding
Yep.
recently, but faith-based organizations are included. And so they're having to diversify their sources of funding. They're having to look for different ways to market, for lack of a better term, and fundraise and develop that don't exist going through certain government channels, which they've been able to do for 20 to 30 years at this point. So, of course, you're going to see changes like that. But I don't know that you're going to see the faith have to change necessarily any more than it ever has. So that's what pops into my brain. Does any of that resonate with you? Do you have anything to add?
I think I pretty much agree with you. I don't know that our response as Christians changes. People may well disagree with me on this. I always want to say you are welcome to disagree with me. And so many of these things are meant to be first words, not necessarily last words. This isn't the last word on this. So as we started, both of us would be happy to have personal conversations with anybody where we can go deeper into these things than we're going into here. And, if you think I'm gravely mistaken on something, I'd love to have the opportunity to speak in person and pursue this in greater depth. But and I realize people disagree with this, but I don't see Christianity operating as a worldly political system. And by that, I mean that um, when we're looking at politics, by and large, what we're generally trying to do in democracy, and I think this is a good thing. I think this is a lot of what you preached on Sunday, if I understand correctly, is that human beings can be fallible and deeply flawed. We can be prejudiced and hateful and hurtful. There are ways we need to protect each other from that. And politics erects laws that establish limits that guarantee that the vulnerable populations are protected. For instance, before everybody believed that, let's just say, black people were really people, we needed to create laws that said, it doesn't matter what you believe, you're going to treat them like this, right? And those laws provided the protections that were needed. And that's a good thing. But a better thing is to change somebody's heart so that they really become to believe that a black person is a person just like any other. Skin color doesn't matter. We're all people. We're all people that Jesus died for. Far better to come to the place where we all believe that together, and then those laws aren't needed.
Right.
What I think politics does, there's the old saying, what do you call a person who is convinced of something against their will? Well, they're unconvinced still, right? They've never really
Right.
been convinced.
Right.
And Stephen Covey did powerful analysis on the use of power, and I'll never forget it. He said, you can apply power if a person is, let's say, 6 inches up and you want them to be 6 inches down, you can apply power to force them down to that lower level. But the second that force is removed that's pushing them down, they just spring back to their old position, maybe even higher to their old position. So I can use politics to force you to do something as long as I'm in power. But the second I'm out of power, you're going to just go back to what you're doing. So I'd far rather change your heart or have my heart change where my heart needs to be changed. And I think that's what Christianity was about. It wasn't trying to create winners and losers, because it never feels good to lose. I mean, it's never felt good to me to lose. Rather than trying to force people to do sometimes that's the best we can do. Sometimes we do need to do that. But better is to introduce people to God so that we can align our hearts with God's heart and begin to embrace God's vision for the human family, Jesus' vision for God's kingdom, which we sometimes refer to as the beautiful neighborhood. So I don't think that changes no matter what the regime is. That's as Christians, that's our primary responsibility, not to achieve some political end, but to introduce people to God. And in the Christian tradition, we do that through the person of Jesus and the saving work of Jesus and what Jesus taught and what Jesus envisioned and so on and so forth, so that our hearts will be transformed, that our hearts will be made new, and that we'll come to see people like God sees people. And then we don't need all these laws because we're doing the right thing. We're doing whatever's noble and lovely and true and excellent. And anyhow, it's what you said.
I was going to say, this dovetails just perfectly with the sermon that we had this past week. Exactly right. At the end of the day, Jesus is going to change hearts. Laws are not. They're just gonna, as you said, it's gonna just try to force people into being convinced, and that doesn't work.
But you and I both know there's people who disagree with us, who see the gospel as fundamentally political, who see Jesus as fundamentally political. Maybe they're right and maybe we're wrong, and we just don't have the opportunity to address that in depth, in part because we don't have those people here sitting with us presenting their view. So if that's somebody who's listening to us, we welcome either further questions that let us go deeper on this, or personal conversation where we can go deeper on this.
Yeah.
We're not trying to shut down conversation. We're not trying to say that our way is necessarily even right. We're just saying that this is how we see it.
I completely agree with that. I think even people who believe that the gospel is political don't necessarily need to disagree with what we're saying here, that changing the world to be more like Jesus is what comes first. And perhaps the difference is people who consider themselves in the gospel is political camp might think that the best means or the first means or primary means will be through a political institutional process versus, maybe we think evangelism is the best way to change the world. And so I guess just to be charitable, I think for some people, it's a question of means, but not of end. And that many Christians ultimately agree that the true end is making more followers of Jesus, making better followers of Jesus is what's going to change the world. And it's just a disagreement about the best way to do that. I think even, for instance, some what are called liberation theologies will make the argument that it's not until people have food and shelter that they're even able to ponder Jesus because they're just trying to eat that day.
Right.
I don't know that I 100% agree with that perspective, but it's not an unreasonable one. At least it comes from a reasonable and good, well-intentioned place. So I think that these sorts of questions, maybe one place to end would be to think about the change in the Episcopal Church over time. I think a lot of positions that we take for granted today were pretty radical at one point. I mean, you brought up race and ethnic relations, but you could even look at something like free speech, which is back in the news all the time these days for both political parties.
Yeah, and is imperiled, frankly.
From both political parties.
Right, exactly
and
right.
again, that's my own
Exactly
view.
right.
And many of those listening will know that my own background most recently is from a free speech and First Amendment advocacy group. So again, that might just be my own background seeping into this. But that is a good example of a position that the Episcopal Church was a little bit on the front line of, going back to the 50s and 60s, that became ascendant within American culture. And in fact, if you look at Supreme Court decisions, they've never been more pro free speech than they have been in the last 10 to 20 years. But we might be going back the other direction. At least it's theoretically possible that politically the winds are changing. And so it could be that certain things we've taken for granted are going to be more up in the air, that those political winds are going to change, and that certain groups, in particular, I would say the Episcopal Church has always been committed to, like you said, asking questions and free inquiry and free speech. So it could be that in some sense, it feels like faith is more under the gun or more under pressure or in the limelight or whatever metaphor you want to use. But again, I don't think that changes the big picture, which is that living as a Christ follower is always going to work in some areas, not work in other areas. Some states are going to have problems with some things, and some governments are going to have problems with other things. There's always been that, going back to Roman times, this oscillation between acceptance and tolerance and persecution. And we just have to keep following Jesus no matter which way those political winds blow.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. I might just add, for me, it really comes down to the use of power. I mean, that's what it really comes down to, is the use of power. And I think this can come back to our original family systems. I mean, sort of all systems, like who has the power and who doesn't, and how do we use the power in those systems. It has never, ever felt good to me when people have powered up on me. I think of the most painful things in my life, that those are the most painful things. And I mean, sometimes literally, right? What Jesus represents is this absolute refusal to power up. I mean, that's the cross. Jesus has all these opportunities to power up, but he doesn't. He chooses to love instead.
If you think Jesus is giving you permission to bully others, then you're probably not listening to the Jesus in the New Testament. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. And I just think that bullying for all of us is so tempting.
Yeah.
And I think we don't always realize even when we're doing it.
Right.
But Jesus is calling us away from that. He's calling us to a whole nother way of relating and being together. When I was first, we had a church softball league. And I remember there was a team that loaded up their team with ringers, right? They powered up. And boy, they just beat us to a pulp. And I remember sitting out in the field just feeling absolutely miserable, just feeling, just completely helpless and frankly angry. And all of a sudden, it just started to dawn on me that this was really what Jesus refused to do. He refused to stack the team. He refused to, because he knew how bad it feels. So that my call really was, rather than build a better, stronger team, go back to our church and say, okay, where are our ringers? Let's make this team even more power, and let's grind these guys to the pulp next time so they see how it feels. Right, which is my initial temptation. I've had enough of this. Let's show them who's boss. It's like, no, you stand there and you suffer. Until that day, we can just all simply learn to play together and play well and enjoy the game. Because that's the goal. The goal isn't to create the one who calls the shots or holds the power, who does all that sort of stuff. The goal is to learn to live together. The goal is to learn to play together. The goal is to learn to enjoy being together. And that skill's never going to come through powering up.
Mhm.
At least not in my experience.
Yeah. Well, you've heard it here first, folks. If you want to be on a winning church softball team, St. Matt's is
It's
not
not it.
the team to join.
It was a different church back then.
Well, thanks everyone for listening. And again, if you want to submit questions, you can do that at stmats.org/questions. That's stmtts.org/questions. And we look forward to talking to you next week, where I will be in Jamaica.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And
I
guess
can't wait to hear about that.
we will either record it remotely, or you'll have a special guest like I did when you were out.
Yeah. And the week you come back, you're all going to talk about it in church, right? And
Yep, that's right. You'll get to hear about the Jamaica trip.
It's a great team going. That's going to be, I can't wait.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll talk to you next week.